The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Law professor James Forman Jr. says it's important to remember that almost all criminal justice decisions are made at the local level, often by African-American officials. CBS legal correspondent Jeff Pegues runs down the recent history of black versus blue relations in urban America. And voting rights lawyer Ezra Rosenberg talks to Bill Press about the fallacious attempt by a Trump commission to prove voter fraud. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Yale law professor and former public defender James Forman Jr. notes that to get elected, African-American local officials often are tougher than anyone else on criminal justice issues. And we say hello to James Forman Jr., professor at Yale Law School, former Supreme Court clerk, and a public defender in Washington, D.C. He's also the author of a new book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. James Forman Jr., thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
It's certainly our pleasure. And, much, of course, has been written about police violence against African Americans and about the Black Lives Matter movement. But your book goes deeper than the headlines. Why did you write it?
Well, a few reasons. I mean, one of the things is that, we often hear this line, and it's particularly, you hear this from conservatives, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, but every time we have arguments about police violence or there's a demonstration or there's a shooting and there's a response, one of the things that you hear from a lot of conservatives is, how come the black community is only complaining about police violence? How come they're not complaining about crime in their own communities? And, I quote Rudy Giuliani to that point, but I could have quoted 30 people making that point from the right. And I think this book, in a lot of ways, is a 239-page rebuttal to that claim, because what you see is from the 1970s onward, when this first generation of African-American elected officials, police chiefs, prosecutors, judges, probation officers came into power and authority, you see a community that's consumed with fighting crime, right? That's absolutely committed to stopping addiction in its tracks, to rooting criminals out, root and branch. Now, in many ways, I think we chose the wrong approaches, right? And one of the big arguments of the book is that the tragedy here is that a lot of African-American leaders ended up going along, some willingly, some less so, but ended up going along with the tough on crime agenda over the last 40 or 50 years. And so that's a problem that I point to. But this idea that black people don't care about crime in their communities is just a lie, and it needs to be called out for that.
Mm-hmm. How does your own background as the son of a civil rights leader, James Forman Sr., as a Supreme Court clerk, and as a public defender in Washington, D.C., how does that inform your views?
Well, very much so. I mean, that's what brought me to the job. So I became a public defender in the mid-1990s. This was before the term mass incarceration existed, but we did already know that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. We already knew that the United States had become the world's largest jailer. We passed Russia and South Africa to become the world's largest jailer in the early 1990s. And I looked out at that world, and then I thought about my own background. My parents, my dad's African-American, my mom is white. They met in the civil rights movement. They fought together in the civil rights movement. They met and became a couple at a time when marriages like theirs were banned in many states in this country. And when I looked at the opportunities that have been created for my generation, for people like me, as you said, clerking on the Supreme Court, now as a public defender, I could also see that those opportunities hadn't been presented for the community as a whole, right? A lot of the kids that I grew up with in Atlanta, I lived in a working class neighborhood. A lot of kids I knew from high school had ended up getting caught up in the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. So I felt like for me, the criminal justice system was the civil rights issue of my generation. And so that's why I chose to kind of plant my flag there and join the D.C. Public Defender Service.
Now, America has by far the highest rate of incarceration in the world. How does that relate, if at all, to crime rates? And actually, this is going to be a multi-tiered question, if you don't mind. But and how much of the rate is due to racism, and can any of it be traced to white America's Puritan heritage?
Oh, well, that's three big questions.
Yes, it is.
Altogether, right? Those are each huge questions, but I'll do my best, and we can kind of dive into them. So, just to take the crime rates point for the first of all, I think there is and there isn't a relationship between crime and incarceration. So, here's a way in which they are related. In the 1960s, during the decade right before this first black political class came in to have any kind of power and authority in the 1970s, we saw the biggest crime rise in American history in the 1960s. So homicide tripled in Washington, D.C. It doubled nationally. Addiction, heroin addiction in particular, was taking its toll on the black community to the point that in D.C., 3% of the people entering D.C. jail were considered addicts in 1963. By 1969, that 3% had become 45%. That's a terrifying epidemic. And so those realities, right, the reality of rising crime and rising violence was very much in the mindset of black African-American leaders in the 1970s, and it's part of what produced this commitment to fighting crime aggressively, to passing the strict gun control laws, as D.C. did, to not decriminalizing marijuana, which is something that the city considered doing and decided not to do it in 1975. And their thinking was in part, we just got over the heroin epidemic. How can we make drugs more widely available to our children? So crime and fear of crime have definitely been a motivation to support tough-on-crime laws in this country. And actually, we shouldn't even call them tough-on-crime because I don't think they're tough. I don't think they're effective, but they are punitive. Now, having said that, it's also very clear that the movement to create a bigger, meaner, harsher criminal justice system had a life of its own, and that there were people, and this gets to your point about racism, right? There are people, there are elected officials or would-be elected officials, people like Barry Goldwater and then Richard Nixon and then Ronald Reagan, and their parallels and analogs at the state and local levels, who clearly saw that there was an opportunity to exploit fears of crime and the association that we have in our mind as Americans of blackness with criminality. There was a way in which they could exploit that to send a signal to white voters, especially in the South and in the Midwest, but also in the Northeast, to send a signal to white voters that, hey, I get your concerns about race. We can't say race anymore. We can't blame the black people anymore, but we can talk about crime, right? So you just need no clearer example of that than something like the Willie Horton ad in the late 1980s, where George H.W. Bush had this grainy figure of this black man, and it was this claim of, he was released on a work release program, and he committed a very, very violent crime. And that was a problem in and of itself. But the racial imagery in that video was so powerful, and it was such a signal to white voters. And so it's both of these things, right? There's both a racism story, which is powerful and important. It's also true that crime was going up, and that made people legitimately scared. And it's also true, as the last part of your question indicates, that this Puritan instinct and history is part. There is a notion in America. We've always had a higher prison population than European countries throughout our history. It's never been so high as it is recently, but it's always been higher. And one of the reasons is we have this notion in this country that, it's an eye for an eye, and it's you did the crime, you do the time. And that notion that each of us stand individually, that we don't necessarily have a community that we can rely on, is something that can be pretty deeply ingrained in American culture, and it does support a kind of a harshness that you see throughout our criminal justice system and throughout our society, right? It's one of the reasons why our social safety network is so much weaker than it is in a lot of countries in Europe that we compare ourselves to.
And and then you go back to the race thing though too, and you do the crime, you do the time, but in reality, a white kid sells an ounce of pot on the corner versus a black kid selling an ounce of pot on the corner. The time is different. There's a lot of unfairness there as well.
Absolutely, and absolutely. And so when I say, it's all of these things together, right? So you do the time, you do the crime is something you hear a lot in this country, and you see it sometimes applied, to white kids as well. There's plenty of white people in this country that are serving long prison sentences, right? And there's and the one thing that we know about them, I spent a lot of time in prisons. I meet a lot of white people in prisons. And the one thing we know about them is they almost all were poor when they grew up. They almost all went to bad schools, and they almost all had parents who either were addicted to drugs or in other ways were not fully fit to raise them. These are things that we see across our society. So let's be clear about that. At the same time, you are absolutely right. In Washington, D.C., again, which is the city that I write most about in my book, black people, before D.C. passed decriminalization in 2014, black people were 8 times more likely to be arrested for heroin possession than white people. Now, every statistical survey that has ever been done on drug use shows that it is equally distributed throughout society. White kids, and this is common sense, we all know this, your listeners know this, white kids use marijuana as much as black kids, and not just kids, adults as well. Asian, Latino, there's no distinctions based on race and whether you use marijuana. So how do you explain an 8-to-1 disparity in arrests? The way you explain it is exactly what you just suggested, is that black communities are much more aggressively and heavily policed. And that aggressive and heavily policing has continued even after crime has gone down. So it was initially justified in response to heroin, which we talked about, and crack in the 1980s. But that style of policing and that mentality that takes over police forces, that it goes on even when the initial crisis that gave rise to it has abated.
We're speaking with James Forman Jr., professor at Yale Law School, author of a new book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. James, you worked as a public defender in a majority black city where the criminals, the police, the prosecutors, the judges, and the juries were mostly African American. Yet you write in some ways it was no different than anywhere else in terms of the public's demand for a war on crime. How do you explain that?
Well, that is really, for me, is the heart of the book, right? And it's the heart of the struggle that my colleagues and I at the Public Defender's Office faced when we would talk about this issue. I mean, one of the cases that I write about in the book is a young man by the name of Brandon. He was a teenager. He was charged with possession of a gun. He pled guilty to possession of a gun, possession of about $15, $20 worth of marijuana. And I was asking him to be released. His mom and grandmother were there in court. I had a letter from his football coach, another letter from his teacher. It was his first arrest. And Brandon's African-American, as were almost all of my clients. And the prosecutor in this case, she was also African-American. She was asking him to go to Oak Hill, which is D.C.'s juvenile prison, a really kind of horrible and dangerous place that has since been closed down but was open then. And everybody knew how bad it was. And then the judge that had to make the decision, Judge Curtis Walker, I changed the names of some of the key figures for their privacy, but Judge Walker, he looked down at Brandon, and then he's got an African-American lawyer representing him, asking him to get out, a black prosecutor asking him to be locked up, and the judge, African-American, looks into Brandon and says, "Son, Mr. Foreman has been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough, son. Let me tell you about Jim Crow segregation." See, the judge knew that time period, and so he begins to lecture Brandon about what it was like to live then. And then he says, "So people marched, fought, and died for you to be free. Dr. King died for you to be free. And I tell you this, he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and harming your community. No, he did not. So I hope Mr. Foreman is right. I hope you turn it around. But right now, actions have consequences, and your consequence is Oak Hill. And he locked him up. And from that day onward, and I had other cases like that. It's not unusual in D.C. to be in a majority black courtroom. It's not unusual at all. And the city council that passed the drug and the gun laws that Brandon was sentenced under was a majority black council. The maximum sentence you can get in Washington, D.C. for selling any amount of a hard drug, marijuana, not marijuana, but heroin or cocaine, is 30 years. That law was passed by a majority black city council. The police chief in D.C. was African American. The police force was African American. So I knew in my mind from that time on that somebody needed to tell this story, right, to go alongside these important accounts that we already have. And you and I have been talking about the role of racism in our criminal justice system, right? And books like Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson and Between the World and Me by Coates and New Jim Crow by Alexander. I mean, these books have really beautifully and brilliantly kind of laid out that story. And then I felt like, okay, wait, but there's another part of the story. Somebody has to explain the mentality of that judge, right? What was he thinking when he was doing that? Because he wasn't racist, at least not in the traditional sense. And so I wanted to explore that. And you asked, so why? And part of the story I mentioned is that rising crime, right? And feeling like you have to protect the community. And then part of the story for this judge, I think, is he viewed himself as the civil rights figure in the story. Remember, I took the job because I was the descendants of civil rights workers. But notice what the judge did. He flipped that history on me. He invoked Martin Luther King to do the opposite of what I was there asking for him to do. So you have this group of leaders that sees protection of the community as a civil rights issue, as a civil rights concern. Because remember, black victims of crime historically didn't get their crimes against them didn't get investigated. Black communities for centuries in this country were under-policed and under-protected. So people like this judge imagine themselves remedying that history. So, and then, of course, part of it is class, right? We talk a lot about race, but class is also important to add to the conversation because the judge was from a different background. All of us professionals in the courtroom, we were from a different economic circumstances than was Brandon and his family. We lived in different neighborhoods. We were all black, but that doesn't mean everybody's the same. So that's a piece of the story as well.
Now, along those same lines, do you get the feeling that the Clinton administration's support for mandatory minimum prison terms and Hillary Clinton's description of predatory offenders, do you get a sense that's a factor in her loss last November?
It's so hard always to predict, right, what, especially in that election of all elections, it's so hard to know what, caused losses. But I think it had to have some effect. I think that it was some of what made black voters maybe, sour on Hillary Clinton a little bit. And again, I'm not a statistician. I'm not Nate Silver. I consume that literature, but I don't produce it. But I have the sense that there was some depressed turnout in some communities, and I think that some of it did have to do with both her initial comments, but also I don't know that there was ever quite the fully coming to terms with or reckoning or kind of an apology that was sufficiently robust. And I don't really blame Secretary Clinton for that. I mean, I think it's almost the nature of politicians. They don't like to say, I really, really blew it. Yeah. I'm really sorry. But I so much wanted her to hear her say in a really kind of deep and authentic way, yeah, I said that. And those were terrible times. Crime was incredibly high, and racism is powerful in America. And it affected all of us, even me. And I said things about black young people that nobody should say about any child. And I'm sorry. Right? That's the kind of full-throated, introspective apology that I want. But I want that. I want that in general from politicians, and I just don't think, they're built that way. That's why I'm not a politician.
Well,
because I would say something like that, and then probably it would be used against me on a TV ad.
Well, right, there is that. But I mean, I think all of us would expect that from any other human being, with whatever the circumstances are. If you've done or said something that needs to be apologized for, then you should do it. I mean, that's, but as you say, it's a politician's life, and perhaps things are looked at a little bit differently in their world. Since crime and punishment are almost entirely local issues, shouldn't the emphasis for reform be on city councils and state legislators?
I am so glad that you asked that question, because in my mind, as we, are here today having this conversation, there is no more important issue. So Jeff Sessions, of course, and Donald Trump get this extraordinary amount of attention. I don't know what your Twitter feed or Facebook page are like, but, I am constantly bombarded with the latest outrage, especially from Jeff Sessions. And it is outrageous what he's doing. But here's the thing that I think we have to focus on as progressives. 88%, remember that number, 88% of prisoners in this country are in state, county, and local facilities. 12% are in the federal facilities that Jeff Sessions' prosecutors can either fill up or not, right? So the federal government is a relatively small player in our criminal justice system. They have some ability to influence funding and other things, no question about that. But the big fight here is state, county, and local. So what I'm always talking to my friends about, talking to my students about is, if you care about things like the school-to-prison pipeline, right, where kids are suspended or expelled for minor violations, right, that then leads a road to the prison system later. If you want to change that, run for school board, because it's the school boards, not Jeff Sessions, that determine whether your city has zero tolerance policies or not. If you want to defeat the war on drugs, the place to fight that is in the state house. That's where the drug laws are all passed, are in the state capitals around this country. And if you really want to have an influence on whether people that are charged with crimes are given second chances, are given the opportunity for redemption, or are just thrown away forever, then we need to be focused on our local prosecutors' races. The local prosecutor is the most powerful person in the criminal justice system. And very few people notice this, but last November, as Trump was being elected, we progressives, for the first time, elected a slate of progressive prosecutors from Florida to Alabama to Texas to Chicago to Colorado. And then just a few weeks ago or last month, not that long ago in Philadelphia, a civil rights lawyer turned prosecutor won the Philadelphia DA's race. A guy in Texas won the local prosecutor's race. He's a defense attorney with the words "not guilty" tattooed across his chest. He ran for prosecutor, and these aren't people that are hiding their views. They ran for prosecutor on the argument that the war on drugs has gone too far, that mass incarceration is a problem. So if we want to change the 2.2 million people in prison, 7 million people under criminal justice supervision, if we want to reform that, our fight has to be fundamentally at the state, local, and county level.
Okay. James Forman Jr., professor at Yale Law School. His new book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. James, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we do look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. CBS legal correspondent Jeff Pegues describes the long history of antagonism between African-American communities and the police. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Excellent news, folks. Jobs are now plentiful. As the Associated Press put it, the U.S. job market has settled into a sweet spot of steadily solid growth. At long last, then, the American dream is back for working families, right? No. The AP article later admitted that the jobs market still is missing any, quote, broad acceleration in pay. In other words, you can find work, but don't expect to be paid. And forget about such luxuries as health coverage, pension, sick leave, vacation time, and having a regular schedule. These are not jobs, they're jobettes. Most are in service work, from fast food chains to nursing homes and car washes. Nearly all are poorly paid, temporary, and routinely exploitative. So many families have been in dire economic straits for so long that they're now having to take such onerous, one-sided terms of employment as those, which, ironically, increases the power of low-wage corporations. With hundreds of thousands of people scrambling at once to find jobs, the bosses can effectively conspire to hold pay levels down and get away with treating hires as disposable cogs in the corporate profit machine. Indeed, the phenomenally bloated profits they've been enjoying are largely extracted from the labor of these vulnerable workers they underpay. And in a double irony, corporations rationalize the obscene salaries and bonuses they give to top executives by pointing to those same profits the executives are taking out of the workers' paychecks. This is Jim Hightower saying, this selfish, self-perpetuating expansion of inequality is no sweet spot of solid growth. It's the sign of a severely sick economy, and it will kill all hope of a democratic America unless we the people rise up to reject the plutocratic profiteers and politicians who are inflicting such deadly disparity on our society.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Stop and frisk procedures are responsible for driving a wedge between local communities and the police, says CBS legal correspondent Jeff Pegues. And we say hello to Jeff Pegues, who's the Justice and Homeland Security correspondent for CBS News, author of a new book, Black and Blue, Inside the Divide Between the Police and Black America. Jeff Pegues, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you, Jim.
Great to have you with us. Now, why has there been a spike in urban homicide? And doesn't Trump's political use of the trend ignore the fact that these are local police issues?
Well, listen, these are really, as you mentioned, local police issues. You talk to police chiefs across the country, they know that. It's not one size fixes all. You can't deal with a problem in New York and expect it to work in Ferguson, for example, or Baltimore, for example. There are individual factors in each and every one of these cities. And some of the cities, for example, Chicago, there has been an issue with police officers who feel like they are not being appreciated. Maybe they aren't as proactive as they used to be. As a result of that, you have that at play in some communities, in other communities across the country as well. So you have to take these police departments individually. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand about policing, is that the police chiefs who lead these departments, they are, in a lot of ways, they're like a coach who has to strategize. Well, how do we stop crime from popping in this neighborhood? How do we address these issues in this neighborhood? It's unique. So you really have to take it block by block in a lot of ways. And we see that happening now. And yes, you cannot generalize about crime issues in this day and age across the country. You have to look at these problems individually. And yes, perhaps the Trump administration at times is generalized. And as we've pointed out over time, a lot of the statistics that they point to just aren't an accurate reflection of what's really going on. The reality is police officers in this country have made and helped to make this country safer than ever before. However, there are some outliers. Chicago over the last 4 years has been one of those outliers where it's seen these major record spikes in crime. However, on the flip side of that, you have New York City, which has done away with some of the stop and frisk policies, even though some people say that they're just reporting them in a different way. But they have largely done away with that, and they are seeing record drops in crime. So you really have to look at these cities individually. They're all unique in how they are reacting to the crime and how people in the communities live with the crime every day, and how police chiefs are trying to counter what is developing in their individual communities.
Jeff, tell our listeners, if you would please, what the broken windows theory of policing was and where it went wrong.
Well, this is something that started in the 80s in New York City, and it was the idea, and it's a crime-fighting strategy that's rooted in enforcing minor infractions that could lead to major crimes. For example, in the 80s, I would go into the city, New York City, and you drive up and someone would jump out and try, jump off the curb and try to clean the windows of your car. And it was a major problem in New York City. And then you had other issues, relatively minor crimes that were not being enforced. And so Rudy Giuliani and William Bratton at the time, Bill Bratton came in and they bought into this idea of broken windows, so enforcing minor infractions that could lead to major crimes. So you start arresting the people who were the squeegee guys who were trying to wash the windows and really slowing down traffic. You would enforce the minor crimes to prevent the criminal, and this is what the thinking was, from thinking that they could get away with something bigger. That led to stop and frisk, that led to zero tolerance policies, and then that over time leads to the rifts, because the more you crack down on crimes like this, and sometimes a lot of times really, there were cases where people were swept up without probable cause, thrown in jail, and that's where you start leading to problems when that type of theory, it's taken to a level where it's impeding on the lifestyle of people in the community. You're being harassed, or at least people in the community feel like they are being harassed. And that is what leads to these divisions that we have seen over the last several years. And so broken windows policies were successful in New York. And then as a result of the success in New York, obviously people say if you can make it here in New York, you can make it anywhere. And so that type of policing spread to departments across the country, bigger and smaller departments. And then you would have these types of policies, stop and frisk, driving a wedge between black and blue. And so that's how it developed over time, and that's where I think, and according to the people I've spoken to for the book, that's where it went wrong, and that's why you see a lot of departments moving away from stop and frisk type policies, because they know that it has created this rift.
What else lay behind community distrust of police?
Well, part of it is history. If you look back throughout history, it was police enforcing Jim Crow laws, police enforcing segregation, and that is history that is not lost on the black community. And there are still remnants of that in the black community, in that this is information about police and experiences with police that are handed down from generation to generation. As an African American, I had the talk with my parents about how to interact with police. My parents were from Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, and they grew up in the heart of the civil rights movement. And so they had these negative interactions with police who were enforcing segregation and Jim Crow laws at the time. So there is a lot of history there, and this is something that is starting to be discussed among law enforcement, that, hey, we have to acknowledge that we were on the front lines of enforcing some of these discriminatory laws. It's something that I talk about in my book, Black and Blue, and how Terrence Cunningham, the president at the time of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, made this speech in October of 2016, in which he apologized on behalf of law enforcement for the history of law enforcement as it in regard to how it enforced segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so this is also something that former FBI Director James Comey has talked about over time. And so all of that is reflected in the book. So you cannot deal with the issues of today in policing and the relationship between black and blue without looking back on that history. And that is something that is talked about in the book, and that is something that people on both sides acknowledge in the book as well.
Is part of the problem that the wrong people are attracted to police work, either the bullying, power-hungry personalities, or even those who themselves have a criminal background, as in Washington, D.C.?
I don't think so. I mean, based on what I've learned in my research and in covering law enforcement over the last 25 years, 99.9% of the people who are doing that job are doing it for the right reasons, and they are doing it the right way. The problem is, how do you recruit and increase diversity? Because that's a problem in the ranks as well, the lack of diversity. You have to, and there are a lot of police officers and police officials who acknowledge this, you have to have a police force that reflects the community. Now, the problem right now is, how do you do that in an atmosphere where police are on TV and oftentimes portrayed in a negative light? You have this video that goes viral of police doing the wrong thing. How do you recruit in that kind of atmosphere? And as I pointed out in the book, there are a lot of departments across the country that are having a really difficult time reaching their recruiting numbers, getting people to join the force because of this negative perception in some quarters of police. So you have police chiefs now that are trying to find ways, innovative ways of finding new recruits and getting people to buy into the idea of protect and serve. But again, the majority of police officers are doing this the right way, but there are some bad apples, and the good cops want the bad apples out.
Since Ferguson, have there been any success stories, turnarounds in police community relations?
Well, I think there are small success stories. Perhaps you've seen images on TV of police officers in community putting their own spin on community relations. Maybe it's kicking a soccer ball with the kids or dancing with the kids. It's a small gesture, but that kind of thing goes viral too. And people around the world see this image of a police officer doing the right thing. So part of reform is also changing the image and boosting the image of police officers across the country. On a larger scale, there have been success stories. I mean, I think if you look at New York City, for example, which is often leading the way in law enforcement innovation, look at what has happened there since stop and frisk was thrown out as unconstitutional. Now, there's some people who say that they still do a form of stop and frisk in New York City, but it's just not being reported. Those are critics of the police department who will say that, and it's important to mention that. But if you look overall at the numbers and the changes that have been made in New York City under Bill Bratton, who is retired in 2016, there have been some real changes there, and still the crime numbers have gone down. So they've stepped back from stop and frisk policies, but still the crime numbers go down. So I think it's fair to say that New York is a success story, and there are changes underway with Chief Delrish Moss in Ferguson. And though it may take time, and this is something that he has said to me in the past, it may take time to bring about these changes. It is one step at a time in a community like that has had so many issues with policing. But he appears to be making changes there, and even in places like Baltimore, changes are underway. And what I'm hearing over and over again is, despite what the federal government does, despite who's in the White House, you have these local departments that are intent on moving forward in a positive way and bridging the gap.
All right, and Jeff, before we let you go, in your opinion, what needs to be done to reach an ideal state of affairs between police and citizens, especially in high crime areas?
Well, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just police reform, but it's also community leaders looking at these communities where police officers are going every day and their lives are on the line, and figure out, well, what is also part of the problem here? And you cannot deny that part of the problem is a lack of investment in some of these communities, a lack of hope in some of these communities. And so until you acknowledge that there is also an economic and social component to what's going on in the relationship between black and blue, you're not fully dealing with the problem. And I talk to people in the book, in the community, and on the policing side who speak to that, who talk about these issues. And so that is key to moving this debate forward in a positive way. It's not all about policing. Some of it is about how do you help these communities? How do you help these communities progress economically? How do you invest in a positive way? Because I spoke to a young man in Chicago who told me, and this is something that stands out, that, hey, if this were happening in a wealthier community, you would not see black kids getting shot and killed, or the type of things that we're seeing in the inner city right now. And the question is, does he have a point? Are some of these communities facing a situation where there is no hope? There is a lack of opportunity. And then are you putting police officers in a position where they have to be social workers instead of crime fighters? And is that fair to them? So to bridge this divide, you have to get to a point where you're looking at all of the issues that are affecting this relationship between black and blue.
All right, Jeff Pegues, Justice and Homeland Security correspondent for CBS News, author of the new book, Black and Blue, Inside the Divide Between the Police and Black America. Jeff, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and we look forward to having you back again soon.
All right, thank you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with civil rights lawyer Ezra Rosenberg about the fallacy of Trump trying to prove voting irregularities.
The 44, maybe 46 states, whatever, so far have said in response to the Trump administration's request through its Voting Rights or Voting Fraud Commission, for information on voter identification rolls in their states, that they are not going to comply, at least not in full. Ezra Rosenberg is the co-director of the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Joins us in studio to talk about this. Hi, Ezra. It's good to see you.
Hi, Bill. Nice to see you.
Thank you for coming in. Just before we went on air, you were telling me, because I had not heard about the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law before. How did you get started?
It has really a legendary history. Back in 1963, Bobby Kennedy suggested to his brother John, who was president at the time, that it's time for the private bar to start getting involved in civil rights and pro bono work. So they called in 250 members, leading members of the private bar, to the East Room of the White House, and they sat them down and said, you all better start doing some pro bono work. And that's what started the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. It's been around for 54 years now. We have a full-time staff. We are involved in voting rights and education and housing and criminal justice and stopping hate crimes. Virtually any major civil rights case has the Lawyers Committee's fingerprints on it.
So these are lawyers who are in private practice, right?
Well, the staff is a full-time staff, but we use the private bar to help us litigate our cases and to do other work, such as we have the largest election protection hotline. We had about 150,000 calls in 2016 on our hotline, which is 866 Our Vote, which is still in operation every day, and we urge people to call it if they have concerns about voter suppression, concerns about the Kobach Commission, which we'll talk about.
Right. But this is interesting. So these are attorneys, just because people sometimes have a very negative impression of attorneys, right, that all they're interested in is making more and more money. But these are attorneys who are volunteering their time around the country for good causes pro bono.
Absolutely. Large firms. I was with a large firm called Deckert for decades. And I started working on the Texas photo ID case back in 2012 when I was in private practice for the Lawyers Committee and for the Brennan Center. And after I left Deckert and retired, I started a new chapter of my life as a full-time employee of the Lawyers Committee.
So you've been involved in this a long time, and there's been talk about voter fraud in this country for a long time. In terms of the big picture, before we get to the Kobach Commission, how serious a problem is voter fraud in the United States?
If by voter fraud is meant people pretending they're someone other than themselves and voting, it's not a problem at all. It is non-existent. Study after non-existent in any kind of widespread. Sure, you can find one or two cases. Good example. I litigated the Texas photo ID case.
Yes.
In the 10 years leading up to the passage by the Texas legislature of the most restrictive photo ID law in the country, out of 20 million votes cast in Texas, there were 2 instances of the sort of in-person fraud that a photo ID law could stop. And these 2 instances were, by the way, they were caught. Mm-hmm. One was a guy who voted on behalf of his father who just died. They had the same name. And the other was this genius, apparently, who voted, went back to the same polling station later in the afternoon, voted again on behalf of his brother who was incarcerated at the time. That's it. 2 out of 20 million votes cast. And the equation that's used by people who are using fraud as a means to enact suppressive laws such as strict photo ID laws is that they're willing to stop maybe 2 out of 20 million instances in exchange for suppressing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of votes, primarily minority voters.
And disenfranchising them.
Disenfranchising them. That's correct.
And that's the price of it. I saw that Allison Grimes yesterday, the Secretary of State for Kentucky, mentioned that and we saw this a few years ago. I don't know how many states voter suppressive laws for suppression laws introduced through a lot of them through the American Legal, ALEC,
Yeah.
American Legal.
ALEC is reputed to have been behind the drafting of some of these laws.
Right. But so anyhow, just to finish that, Alison Grimes just said, I heard her say yesterday that there are some 89 laws circulating today in some 30 states along the same lines.
And the sad part of that is these laws are going to be able to go into effect immediately if they're passed and signed by their governors. But that wasn't the situation 4 years ago when we had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in effect. And the United States Supreme Court gutted that law because in states that had a proven record of discrimination, they could not enact laws like that and implement them without getting approval of either the Attorney General or a three-judge court in the District of Columbia.
Right. So that break that existed, like putting on the brakes in those particular states, is gone right now. So
not only are the brakes gone, we don't even know if the accident is happening all the time.
Yeah,
Because in the past, the states and the counties and the cities could not make any change that changed voting requirements in these covered jurisdictions without getting approval. So, for example, they could not consolidate voting districts, which they're doing. And you don't always find out about that in some small areas unless you have feet on the ground or someone calls calls our hotline, for example. So it's a tough situation since the Shelby decision by the Supreme Court.
I think the toughest one for a lot of people to accept is the voter ID. I mean, you hear the argument, and it sounds so simple. Well, look, everybody's got his driver's license. I mean, you can't get in a federal building here unless you show a photo ID. So why shouldn't you have to show a photo ID to vote?
Right. And I have that same discussion with my friends. And then after I tell them this, that first of all, it's not just any ID, which is the sort of thing you could use to get into a courthouse. It's, for example, in Texas. Before the Texas law was enacted, they had an ID law. You had to show either a voter registration card, which everyone had because it was sent to them by the election officials, or a bank statement, a driver's license, utility bill, government checks, a whole bunch of things that are pretty reliable. Despite having no evidence of fraud, the Texas legislature passed a law that limited to just a Texas driver's license, not any driver's license, a passport, a military ID, naturalization card, or it being Texas, a license to carry. And they also said, we're going to give everyone a free photographic election identification card, but in order to get that, you had to go to your motor vehicle station. And believe it or not, 1/3 of the counties in Texas do not have a motor vehicle facility. And Texas is a pretty big state. And people who are poor, who are working for hourly wages, can't take off from work, have family responsibilities, don't have cars because they don't have a driver's license, they'd have to travel maybe an hour and a half taking off from work to get these things. It's different for people. It's easy for me. It's not easy for people who are poor and they are disproportionately minority citizens, and that's the evil of these laws.
Right. So, I mean, throughout all of these laws, there is, if not a direct racist intent, there's certainly a racial implication or factor.
Well, there are
in all of them.
Sure,
right?
And there are
in terms of the people impacted.
In terms of impact, absolutely. And in at least 2 jurisdictions now, it's been proven that they were also enacted with discriminatory intent. In North Carolina is one. And Texas, Judge Ramos in the Southern District of Texas, just about 2 months ago, issued her decision for the second time, finding that Texas's law was enacted with discriminatory intent, and we're in the process now of arguing over what the appropriate remedy should be.
See, I've always been sort of a little surprised at all this discussion about voting rights. It seems to me that what everybody ought to be working on is making it easier for people to vote and exercise, because to vote, so many few people do, such a small percentage do vote in this country. Making it, finding ways, obviously, honestly, right, but easier to vote rather than making it more difficult.
Bill, there's nothing more for me to say other than that.
Don't we have it upside down?
That's what we should be doing. We should be making it easier for people to vote. We should be doing everything to make it easier for people to vote.
Like same-day voter registration, for
Absolutely.
example. Early voting, which so
Absolutely.
many people take advantage of.
Absolutely. And particularly when you realize there is no fraud. It's a big It's a boogeyman that they've created in order to scare people into indicating on polls that, yes, we believe there's voter fraud.
Right.
And then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, look, the voters think there's fraud. The reason they think there's fraud is because you've told them there's fraud when there is no fraud.
Well, then how can you say that, sitting here, Mr. Rosenberg, when we know that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally last year for Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, and the only reason we know that is because President Trump and people like Chris Kobach say it's so.
Right.
That is completely untrue. What I think they're basing that statement on is simply that there are people in every state who are in voting rolls who no longer live in that state. Why? Because I've moved several times in my life. I assume others in this room have moved several times in their life, and I assume your listeners have moved.
Guilty.
And I bet you not a single person has ever, the day they moved, said, oh, by the way, let me call up the election officials and tell them I'm leaving to take. And that's why they're sure they're on, but they're not voting illegally. They just happen to be left on the rolls.
Well, that was one of the things. Remember, whenever this first started coming out, there were Ivanka Trump, Steve Bannon.
Exactly.
All of these Trumpers were registered in more than one state.
Everybody, almost everybody in this country who has moved from one place to another is double registered.
Yeah.
And there's nothing illegal about it. Sure, the rolls can be cleaned up, and the National Voter Registration Act has a specific procedure for cleaning up rolls, and some states do comply with it. Some states do a better job than other states do.
Some do it quicker than others, for example.
Exactly, but it has nothing to do with illegal voting or fraud, and that's the fraud. I mean, and that is what apparently was the germ for this so-called Election Integrity Commission, which, as you indicated, is a voter fraud committee. And as President Trump on June 30th in one of his tweets said, it's a voter fraud committee. It has nothing to do with election integrity. It has to do with this fake story of there being widespread fraud in order to create laws that will have a suppressive effect, particularly on the votes of minority citizens.
But in his letter, which I want to ask you about, to the states that has generated so much controversy, and the reason we wanted to come in today, Secretary of State Chris Kobach he cites, or maybe it was in an interview I saw on CNN with Anderson Cooper, he cites a Pew study about voter fraud.
Yeah, that Pew study, I think, has been the way Kobach is using it has been repudiated by the people who wrote the study. Chris Kobach has a track record of saying things to further his causes, which courts have seriously questioned, and in fact, most recently, have sanctioned him for out in Kansas. Putting Chris Kobach in charge of this commission, and let there be no mistake about it, even though he's the vice chair, he is in charge of this
Pence
commission.
Pence is just the figurehead at the top.
It's like, it's not just putting the fox in charge of guarding the chicken coop, it's putting the fox in charge of creating the chicken coop. And that's basically what the intent of this commission is, to come out with a finding that there's widespread fraud and to lead to the enactment of suppressive voting laws.
At the federal
level.
All right. So the information that he's requested from the states, as we've seen, just off the top of my head, as I recall, right, is he's asked the states to provide for every single person on the voter rolls, right, name, address, date of birth, political party they belong to, whether they ever lived in another state, whether they lived in another country, the elections, all the elections that they have or have not voted on since, I think, 2006.
Right. Military history. And last four digits of Social Security numbers.
How much of that is public? How much of all of that is public information?
There's virtually no state that allows that last bit, particularly the last four digits of Social Security numbers. There are a few states that don't allow a good part of this information, and it is unprecedented for a federal agency to have asked for all of this information all at once for ends that make absolutely no sense unless one wants to create a fake story to support the suppression of votes.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. James Forman Jr., Jeff Pegues, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.